Let's wrap up with just some miscellaneous stuff. Just a few other things to mention. Connectivity, SQL connection, a couple of minor things in 10.3.3c in SQL connection. There's been some improvements in the logging environment. SQL connection has this thing called SQL just-in-time logging. I don't really understand why it's called that, but essentially what it does is it does logging, but only when there's errors, okay? So it's not logging stuff all the time and slowing things down, it's only when there's an issue. Previously, it only logged the SQL connection errors themselves, which without the accompanying database error wasn't that useful sometimes. So the change is it's been enhanced to log the underlying database issues as well. So it's a very nice mechanism for track. So having logging enabled, but it's only going to fire up when there's a problem, but now you'll get a lot more meaningful information. We've also introduced limited support for a new database in SQL Connection API. There seem to be a lot of people expressing an interest in using PostgreSQL on Windows. So we've got a driver available for that now. It is a kind of limited support kind of scenario, though. It's not something we can fully support at this time. The driver is called VTX16. It is shipped as part of the product. So it is there if you want to use it, but it is subject to this best efforts kind of support. There's no real guarantees with it, and we'll see how it goes. There's a couple of other databases that we did that with. I think we did that with MySQL in the early days as well. So if you want to get to PostgreSQL, I've tried it, I've played with it, it worked. Actually, there's two primary versions of PostgreSQL. There's two builds. There's one from Enterprise DB and another one from a company called Big SQL. I found that the Enterprise DB one worked great, and the Big SQL one was a disaster. So if you're using it, I'd strongly recommend you use it with the Enterprise DB distribution of PostgreSQL, which I think is the common one that most people use anyway. Also, we've added support for SQL Server 2016 SQL Native Client. So if you are going to that new Microsoft database, that was introduced in 10.3.3b towards the end of last year. So you'll need to be on that version to get to SQL 2016 through its SQL Native driver. A little change in ODBC, not really affecting the features of the product, but there was a little change that helps installation scenarios. It used to be that if you tried to set your own Genesis home environment variable to say, I want my catalogs here, our installation would come along and just obliterate it and put our own in place, and then we'd remove it on the way out, and you'd wind up with nothing on uninstall. So we fixed that now. If Genesis home is set ahead of time, we will leave it there and honor it and use it, and we will not mess with it on uninstall unless we put it there on install. Also, we added support in 10.3.3c for the Visual Studio 2017 Data Explorer. If you're using ODBC, you can use those Visual Studio tools in the latest version of the IDE to get into that environment and do all of your stuff. Also, connectivity in 10.3.3. So again, this is a year or so ago now, but worthy of mentioning. We added the ability to do network encryption of traffic with the connectivity products. So anything that's using the OpenNet server, the VTX-NetD process. So this affects both SQL connection and the XFODBC driver. Clearly, if you're doing data transfer and you're in a PCI environment or a HIPAA environment or so on, you absolutely need to be doing this. So you need to get to 10.3.3 to enable that feature. But finally, you've got that support for encryption. It works just like the way the XF Server Plus encryption works. So you use OpenSSL and generate a certificate file and plug it in when you start the process and all of that kind of thing. Some things to think about when it comes to OpenSSL and encryption. TLS 1.2 is really what's considered to be the minimum secure environment for doing encryption these days. And we did add support for TLS 1.2 in 10.3.3, but we're not defaulting to it. We still default to something somewhat lower that, strictly speaking, is probably not considered that secure. The reason we did that was the PCI Security Standards Council previously had a requirement that everybody had to be at TLS 1.2 by a certain date, and nobody got there. So they pushed that date out. That date, I believe, is now June 30th, 2018. So we will update the default to match the requirement once it becomes a requirement from the PCI Council. But just bear in mind, you really ought to be trying to do what you can. If you're in a secure environment, you really should be getting yourselves up to using TLS 1.2. Little change here, if you do use OpenSSL with your Synergy products on Windows, the DLLs for OpenSSL, you used to be able to put them anywhere you want and make sure they're available in path. We were having problems with any number of products install their OpenSSL DLLs into the path, and we were finding a lot of conflict scenarios. So now we explicitly require them to be in the DBL bin directory along with the runtime, and we will only load them from there. So if you are using OpenSSL and you upgrade to 10.3.1, you might need to change the location of your OpenSSL DLLs and make sure you keep them up to date as required in that new location. A couple of other miscellaneous things. There was a slight change to licensing scenarios when you're in an app domain scenario. Basically, when you have .NET code running as a service, i.e. with no desktop attached, licenses are now allocated from 10.3.3 on a per app domain basis. So this affects code that's running like WCF services running as a service, things like that. If you've got app domain support in there to segregate and give you multiple environments and protect against those other environments, then licensing is now allocated based on that. Yes, if you were doing app domain licensing, there were a couple of fairly significant issues that were found, and you would tend to get out of license errors in some scenarios. So all of those things have been addressed in 10.3.3c. So if you are doing app domain-based licensing, again, we'd strongly recommend you get up to 10.3.3c. A little minor change, but I thought I'd mention it. 10.3.3c, the set our user utility, that's the one you use to put your user context in place for XF Server and so on, now accepts passwords longer than 15 characters, which was a previous restriction. Just wanted to briefly call out the Xamarin platform. Again, if you're not aware, just to point out that the Xamarin tools, which are the tools that let you do .NET development for iOS and Android primarily, used to be a very expensive product set and are now totally free and included with Visual Studio. So if you are interested in getting into the ability to do mobile development, A, pay attention to Richard and Ashley's sessions, and B, the Xamarin toolset is there. If you've got the latest version of Visual Studio, I think there's from 2015, maybe they even, certainly they plug into 15 and 17, not sure about the earlier ones, but they're now available for free to install. Also, bear in mind that Xamarin Forms can now be used to create cross-platform mobile UI. So all of a sudden, with Xamarin Tools and Xamarin Forms, it really is possible to create a single application that executes and looks native and works well on iOS and Android, and other platforms, in fact. Xamarin Forms now supports WPF. It supported UWP for some time now. So you could create a single app that ran on iOS and Android and Windows 10. Now, Xamarin Forms also supports WPF. So now you can also target Windows 8, Windows 8.1, and Windows 7 with that single Xamarin Forms app. So you can literally create a single app that runs on Windows 7, 8, 8.1, 10, iOS, and Android, and Windows Phone, okay, which is a pretty cool story. Briefly, just to call out the Synergy documentation, we've been doing a lot of work, as Bill mentioned, on the web-based documentation. The documentation is almost complete. I think there's 2 manuals missing now, and they're the minor ones, but pretty much all of the major manuals are now available online. The URL is docs.synergyde.com. Both Workbench and Visual Studio now have menu options that allow you to launch the online version and also the local version of the old PDFs if you have them installed. So both are available. All of a sudden Googling Synergy DBL XYZ statement is great. It takes you straight to the point you want to be at. So, give the online versions a try. Very briefly, PDF API. Since the last conference, we've added support for simple pie charts, simple bar charts, and a feature that was requested at the conference, which was we want to have a PDF which defines the layout of the form and use it as the background for other PDFs so we can just print data onto the top of it and not have to regenerate the background form all the time. So those were added as features. And we've done quite a bit of work on improving. Many more samples are available in the API now. We've done quite a bit of work on the documentation. But these were all in the couple of months after the conference. Not a great deal has changed recently in the PDF API. I am aware of lots and lots of people using it, so thank you for that. And I'm aware of some great success stories. So if you want to produce PDF output from your traditional Synergy or .NET code on any platform, works on Unix, Linux, VMS as well, then give the PDF API a check out. It's all available on github.com/synergex/synpsg-pdf, so it's there for download in a source format, and you just build it and run with it. Again, quick update on CodeGen. Since the last conference, we've done 5 CodeGen releases. We haven't added any major new features. It's mainly been individual developers saying, I wish I could do this, or I wish I could do that, add a little token, add a little if test, that kind of thing, and just responding to those wishes. I have done some work recently where we've added pretty much the database support was really focused on Microsoft SQL Server, and it generated SQL Server types if you use the field SQL name and things like that. There's a new command line switch that you can now tell it that you want to focus either MySQL or PostgreSQL as well, and it generates appropriate data types for those databases. I'm going to do Oracle as well at some point. I haven't got around to it. So if you are trying to generate SQL connection code, it doesn't have to be just about SQL Server these days. And like I say, that's really the only significant thing, but we're constantly looking for things to improve in CodeGen. And again, thank you, because we're aware of an awful lot of people using it as a way of generating, a lot of code these days. Platform requirements, very briefly, not a huge amount of changes, and I'm not going to read through this slide, but this information is all in the resource center in the supported platforms tables. What I will probably call out one time is, Windows Vista really should have gone at this point. Okay, Windows Vista has gone out of extended support now, and there are no more security updates. So you really shouldn't be running Vista anywhere at this point in time. Okay, would be the recommendation. Finally, traveling around the user base, I'm sometimes surprised at how old the gear is that you guys are using, and how often I come across Windows XP on a Core Duo with 2 gigs of memory and a 50 gig, 60 gig hard drive that's running at 5400 RPM, and it takes 8 minutes to launch Visual Studio and stuff like that. So, PCs are pretty cheap these days. We really, as developers, if you're trying to do latest and greatest stuff, you really ought to be using latest and greatest gear. You really should be running Windows 10 with a quad-core CPU, with probably at least 8 gigs of memory, if not more. 8 gigs I really kind of regard as a bare minimum these days. The biggest single thing you can do is don't be using hard drives. Go invest $100 on an SSD. That's all it costs. You can get a 160 gig, 200 gig SSD for under $100 these days. And even the bigger ones are very reasonably priced and make a huge difference to the performance of developing software and how long it takes to build something. And make sure you're using large, high-resolution monitors. Also, be aware that laptops these days, even from some of the premier manufacturers like Lenovo, they've really focused on that ultrabook spec, which really means dumb down the CPU and focus on battery life. And some of those modern systems are not that fast, certainly when compared to a desktop computer. So just maybe it's time to invest. A high-spec developer desktop PC these days, you're probably talking $700-800. So it's really not that big a deal. Okay, that's my product update session. Are there any questions about that? Are there any questions? I'm not seeing any questions. Enjoy your break.